As former President Donald Trump awaits the results of the primary, his civil defamation trial will resume in New York tomorrow. Trump has already been found liable in this second defamation trial brought by writer E. Jean Carroll for comments that he made in 2019 denying that he sexually assaulted her. It is unclear if Trump will be at the courthouse tomorrow. This is just one of his many legal battles. He also faces 91 felony counts in cases ranging from alleged election subversion to the handling of classified documents or mishandling of them. Shelby Talcott and Kyle Kondik join us now. Shelby is a politics reporter for Semafor, and Kyle is the manager editor of Sabato's Crystal Ball at the University of Virginia Center for Politics. Kyle, New Hampshire voters, thanks for joining us here in studio, are considered more moderate than perhaps the further right of the GOP. Does this mean, or would I be correct in assuming that they potentially care more about the Trump cases?
I would think potentially, and we even saw in Iowa that about a third of Iowa Republican voters actually expressed some concern about, maybe being able to support Trump in, for the general election if he's convicted. Now, I think those polls probably overstate things, but you got to remember that American general elections have been very close to competitive for the last couple of decades, and so even if just a relative handful of people would change their mind, that could be enough to change the election. So, one of the themes if Trump is a nominee is he's just going to be in court a lot, and there's going to be a lot of talk about his problems. And I feel like for the past couple of months, a lot of the focus has been more on Biden's problems. Maybe it turns more toward Trump. Maybe it sort of changes the trajectory of the race. Just one of the many variables of 2024.
I mean, one thing that we've been observing and talking and hearing from voters is that it seems that the more cases pile on, the more people, or at least his very loyal base, seems to feel like he's under attack, like they're believing when he says it's a witch hunt and the justice system is not the same for all, and this is just trying to get him out of the race. Shelby, Trump has denied all accusations against him and has essentially used the courtroom as part of his campaign to further this notion. Is that still resonating with voters, and specifically in New Hampshire?
It's certainly resonating with the voters who plan to vote for Donald Trump and Republicans at large, quite frankly. We saw him with a historic win in Iowa, and part of that reason was because there are a lot of Republican voters who buy into his argument that the indictments are politically motivated and that they're coming after me, but it's really them trying to come after you. And so it'll be interesting here in New Hampshire. I think it's safe to say, based on when I talk to voters on the ground who are Republicans and plan to vote for Trump, that message is resonating. Where it's not resonating is the sect of voters, Republican and undecided, who plan to vote for Nikki Haley. They're more likely to say they are concerned about these indictments. They do believe that they have merit, and they're not sure that they can support someone who has so many problems legally going into the general election.
And let me follow up on that, Shelby. Is there such a thing as a hierarchy of relevance when it comes to the cases? I mean, one of the most serious criminal cases is the one that now is in the middle of this divorce scandal involving Fani Willis. Is there one that really stands out to voters that they might care more about, where if he is, if they see the evidence, they might reconsider voting for him?
I think it's safe to say that with the base who is these diehard Trump supporters, there is not one individual case that will convince them that the indictments are not politically motivated, as Trump has claimed. At the same time, when I talk to people who are a little bit more on the fence and do take these indictments seriously, the January 6 ones and the classified documents case are always top of mind, more so than the other cases that he's facing. And so certainly as those go forward, I think that could give people pause on whether or not to vote for him in the end.
And Kyle, now we're talking about a two-person race in the GOP without Ron DeSantis there to absorb the punches from both of them. It's evident that both Nikki Haley and Trump have elevated perhaps the heat in their attacks against each other. However, Nikki Haley has said that she would pardon Trump. Can she, at this point or moving forward, really bank on the cases?
I mean, I think that this whole Republican primary process has been a lot of these candidates kind of pulling their punches a little bit on Trump, particularly on the legal matters, and kind of basically agreeing with him that it's sort of like a witch hunt, but then they don't really go after him on the substance of what he's been accused of. And so I don't necessarily know if that would continue. You know, part of it will. What are the results tonight? Does Haley have some sort of surprising performance, and then does that sort of push her to be a little bit more aggressive? But at the same time, the race could. I mean, I don't want to say it's over, but it could effectively be over, because if Trump wins tonight going away, he'll have triumphed in both Iowa and New Hampshire, two pretty different states in terms of the ideological makeup of the voters.
Do you think that if he wins by just a small margin, or how big does that need to be for Haley to have a realistic road ahead?
I had thought for a while that Haley really needed to win New Hampshire, given where expectations are right now. Maybe like a close second, single digits would allow her to kind of soldier on. But what do things then look like in South Carolina, which is her home state, the next major contest, but also one where the voters are a lot more like Iowa than they are like New Hampshire. And so, Trump has led generally by a lot in South Carolina. And if you can't win your home state, I don't think you have much of a rationale to continue. We saw that with Marco Rubio in Florida in 2016. So that's the next challenge for Haley, if she can actually make it there.
Yeah, that makes a whole lot of sense. All right, Shelby, Talcott, and Kyle Kondik, thank you so much for joining us today.